Hey guys, Andy here. This episode was recorded about the same time that we recorded the It Chapter 2 episode. As you might have known if you listened to that episode, the sound is a little off. This was my fault. The sound has been fixed on both of our ends for the next few episodes. I just wanted to give you the heads up that, yeah, I know it's a little choppy this time around. I'm sorry. Welcome to the Geek 101 podcast, Road to Crisis, Episode 2. Arrow Season 3 and Flash Season 1. I'm your host, Andy Bowman, and with me, again, are special guest stars, Tessa and Sam.
Hello.
Hello.
All right, where we last left off was what I think is the height of Arrow Season 2. And let's just go ahead and get right into Season 3 of Arrow, which has its ups and downs. Do you guys have any immediate opinions about Season 3 of Arrow?
You know, I think the first half of Season 3 of Arrow is actually still pretty strong, mainly because it doesn't get into some of the Batman mythos of the League of Assassins that they get into later in the season. But the first half of Season 3, I actually think starts out fairly strong. We have the death of Sarah at the very beginning. I think, is it the very first episode that she dies? And, you know, she's a character that obviously was a fan favorite, and I think it gave the season some immediate stakes. And it sort of gives us a mystery to pursue for the first half of the season. Who killed Sarah Lance, right? And we get to see sort of the effect that it has on her father and her sister, Oliver, all of these people whose lives she impacted. It's really the last half of the season where it starts to get away, I think, from the writers even. There's too many moving parts in the last half of the season. So just as a general overview, I'd say first half is actually pretty good. Second half is where we start getting into some iffy territory.
Okay. Well, first things up with the first episode, we're introduced to Arrowverse regular and general amazing character, Ray Palmer.
Haircut.
He gets that name a little bit later, but this is, I think, one of the stronger characters introduced in this season in Ray Palmer, who later on becomes the Atom in, I guess, at the very end of the season. What did you guys think about his introduction?
So I'm not going to lie, I really didn't like him when I first watched Season 3. It's actually sort of rewatching parts of Season 3 of Arrow. I like him better now, having, you know, knowing where he goes and knowing sort of what he becomes than I liked him at the time that he was introduced. I think part of it is that when he first comes in, he seems kind of like an Iron Man ripoff. With his, you know, he's this tech genius and he's making a suit that's going to do all these cool things. He's also played by Brandon Routh, who, as we all know, had a very failed attempt at Superman. So it's really interesting to see him take on this character. But, you know, he is pretty charming. Once you sort of get past some of those initial hurdles in liking the character, he does become sort of this interesting addition to Team Arrow because he's so optimistic compared to pretty much anyone else on the team.
Yeah, and from the very first episode, when he is in the scene in the boardroom where Oliver has just addressed everyone about the rocky business things that are going on and everything, and then Ray stands up and he has his belt buckle projector and all of his smarmy smiliness, which is straight out of his Clark Kent character. You're definitely set up to not like him, I think. If you're rooting for Oliver, he is definitely presented as somebody who is the opposite of everything that Oliver is, which makes for some interesting juxtapositions, especially when you start talking about Felicity later on. But, you know, I don't think we're supposed to like him at first, I think.
Yeah, it's just interesting, sort of rereading this character through what we know now. But at the time, I remember really not liking him in his introduction, mainly because I guess I saw him as competition for Oliver and not particularly great competition.
Excuse me, he looks much better than Stephen Amell.
Not talking about looks, although we do get to see him on the salmon ladder later in the season.
We get to see a lot of people on the salmon ladder this season. We get to see Barry and Cisco on the salmon ladder as well.
That's true. I think Cisco is the least impressive person on the salmon ladder.
Well, that's we'll discuss that later.
Poor Ramon.
But the big thing with this season is really basically a retelling of Batman Begins, it seems like.
And not a particularly good one is the problem, I think. We were just talking about earlier. There's so much about this season that tries to be Batman, but not quite Batman. And the actor that they get to play Ra's al Ghul is not actually a particularly great version, especially if you compare him with Liam Neeson. Version for Batman Begins. And so I think the farther they try to get towards Batman, the more they start to fall apart. Mainly because the Arrowverse, or the Arrow, is a very different character, and there are different rules. Rules that he's already broken in previous seasons. So I think part of the problem is trying to fit what the characters and what they've already created in this world into the Batman mold ends up falling apart on them. Also, there are too many characters by the end of this season. Just way too many characters.
Well, luckily, that is a problem that Arrow solves very quickly by not introducing any more characters, right?
Never.
And killing off a character that nobody liked.
So, we have a few plot lines running through this season. One of the plot lines is Oliver leaving the island in the flashback because Amanda Waller. Do you guys happen to remember this plot line at all?
Yeah, Amanda Waller gets to be all kinds of terrible. Basically, anything that Oliver learned about torture and how to be a bad person, he learned from Amanda Waller.
That's what we get from this season.
Yeah.
Is that everything that's negative in Oliver's personality comes from Argus and from Amanda Waller.
Right, comes from the black woman.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sure,
and then we also get this storyline in the flashbacks because he's in Hong Kong, right? And so he's learning all these things from Amanda Waller. He gets sucked into sort of the Argus mission. I guess they're trying to stop a bioterror attack in Hong Kong. This is where the flashbacks for me start to get a little bit sketchy. Tiny bits of information are given each episode. It's almost like they had to slow down the flashbacks in order to sort of make them last for as long as they did. And we also get this really weak rendering of Katana. And it's just not she's not a compelling character, not the same way that she is in the comics. She just sort of exists to give these odd platitudes to Oliver and to provide a moment of emotional fridging later because her son is killed in this bio-terror attack. And I don't know, I just couldn't make a lot of sense out of the flashbacks this season. I'm curious to hear what you guys think about them.
Sam, you can go ahead and go first.
Oh, I straight up stopped caring about the flashback at all. It was a distraction from the hot mess that is going on in the present.
Okay, I will agree with that for the most part. There was a little bit of interesting conversation towards the end of the flashbacks where Oliver is trying to decide whether or not to torture. It's kind of interesting, but for the most part, the flashbacks are very forgettable. And I remember the first time I watched this, there was this thing going on in my head where I'm like, hey, okay, Oliver, these are different situations. This is not the same thing going on. There is a terror attack here. And in this episode, when you're discussing torture, it's pretty relatively minor. Like there are different magnitudes at work here, and the show's trying to equate the morality of torture in both situations, and it to me it's pretty clear cut that it is not the same.
But it worked on Lost. On Lost, whoever the character of the week the flashback was aimed at, or the flash forward, or the flash sideways, or whatever flashing we're doing this week, always managed to link up to whatever was happening in the present. So I don't understand why it doesn't work on Arrow. Isn't it the exact same thing? I don't know that they ever really learned that lesson, which is why once we get past season 5, it's really nice in some ways.
Well, and I think that part of the problem is they're suffering from, the third season, fourth season, fifth season itis, where they're sort of they're past what they had planned on doing, but they don't have an end in sight, and so they're sort of throwing random elements together to see if they will work. And so the storytelling definitely suffers, and the structure definitely suffers this season.
I also feel like in this season, and this, is the too many threads things happening, and this is, how many things can we steal from Batman before they tell us to stop? Which they definitely did after this season. But it's almost like, with throwing things at us to see what works, not only are they doing it narratively, but they're doing it, trying to, again, get as much stuff from Batman as possible. And this is definitely a season of excess that gets pulled back in future seasons.
Right. And I'll talk about this a little bit, but this is also the season where the DCEU makes it very clear what they want to do with the Suicide Squad and a few other characters. So I think Arrow is just kind of denied access to some of this DC lore. But at the beginning of the series, before anything really, there's a situation where Thea Queen finally comes back from after running away and abandoning both Roy Harper and Oliver. In many ways, she's kind of pulling the same thing that Oliver did at the end of season 1, where she's just gone. She comes back with a bunch of new abilities, and it's a little weird. She's very close to Malcolm Merlyn. John Barrowman was upgraded to main cast this season, which I thought was great. Overall, Thea's storyline, I think, is one of the stronger parts of this season.
Oh yeah, I think there's a lot of, like I said, Thea is one of my favorite characters on this show, and this is really a season where she gets to shine in a lot of ways. Maybe because everyone else's storylines are in a disarray, but hers comes through as a really strong thread this season. I think because of her sort of self-imposed mission. At the end of the second season, her mother has died. She doesn't feel like she has anything left. And so she tells Malcolm Merlyn, like, I want to become strong. I don't want to get hurt again. And so being the sort of literal-minded father that he is, he takes her away and proceeds to literally beat the shit out of her until she turns, until she's able to fight back and learn all of these things that he has to offer. And so when she comes back at the beginning of season 3, she has this thing in her arsenal, this weapon in her arsenal, where she can defend herself and protect herself, and we get to see her develop that into something where she uses to save other people and uses for the common good this season. And I think it actually works pretty well in her storyline.
And the pay at the end of the season, where she gets to suit up, that's a good. It's a good payoff.
And she's wearing Roy Harper's suit. At least that's what we're supposed to think. Of course, if she was really wearing Roy Harper's suit, it would not fit her as well as it does when she appears in it. But we get this whole storyline with Roy too, where they're breaking up and then they're back together and then they're breaking up. But then he ends up taking the fall for some things that Oliver is accused of, and he has to leave town. And this marks his exit for the time being from the series. So we finally get to see Thea suit up as Speedy, which is her nickname originally, and we get to see her use a bow and arrow as well, which is one of the cooler moments in this particular season, I think.
Right. So early on, we find Sarah Lance is killed by a mysterious archer. And we very quickly discover that Sarah Lance being killed made Nissa Al Ghul not very happy. and she wants justice. So we kind of get hints early on, but then it doesn't really keep us in suspense here, that Malcolm Merlyn was part of the League of Assassins, and that's where he learned all of his badass fighting skills, right?
Yes. Did we know that before this season?
Yes.
Know that before this season. That's right. We see more of it.
Right. And we also see Laurel start becoming a vigilante with what, like 2 or 3 weeks worth of training.
She doesn't even have enough training before she puts on the suit for, somebody to put together a montage. It's just, hey, it happened.
Well, I don't know. Yeah. Yes, her training is very accelerated, but I remember the first time I watched this, I thought it was very clever the way that, it does really illustrate how out of her depth that she is, because she goes after, is it Brick? Is that one of the secondary villains this season? She
played by Vinnie Jones.
Right. So she goes after some of his henchmen with a baseball bat and gets totally beaten up. And it sort of answers the question, what if a regular person just decided to become a vigilante? What would that even look like? And so, yeah, it is too fast. I mean, she does accelerate and become, this badass by the end of the season a little bit too quickly. But we do get to see, some pretty big failures on her part. She does persist sort of through these failures because of the death of her sister. And she is assisted by Nyssa. Nyssa does train her a bit this season, too. As well as, who's the boxer that she goes to?
Wildcat,
that's right. The boxer helps her, too, Wildcat. So we get a little bit of, a learning curve. Maybe not enough of one, but we get a little bit, at least.
All right. And after a few things go down, we get what I think is one of the strongest episodes of the series, The Brave and the Bold, the first crossover with The Flash, the first real crossover.
And you're saying it's one of the best episodes again because of Cisco on the salmon ladder, correct?
Yeah, I really think it, by highlighting the parts of Arrow that are silly and actually making Grant Gustin kind of mock Oliver a little bit, I think that this works better. They team up to deal with Captain Boomerang, who, strangely enough, is not really in the Arrowverse after this season, and it probably has nothing to do with Suicide Squad becoming a movie.
I have to say, we both talked about this when we rewatched the crossover. Their version of Captain Boomerang is much worse than the DC EU's version. It's just, Captain Boomerang is supposed to be this kind of goofball character, and I think that the Suicide Squad film, for all its faults, tried to capture that a little bit better than this particular version of Captain Boomerang. He's just too gritty and growly, and he's special ops, but he uses boomerangs. This is one of the problems I think with Arrow that the Flash successfully sort of navigates, is that it's still a comic book, but it's trying sometimes a little bit too hard to give us grittier versions of these characters when they're not really that gritty to begin with. But that would be my only real critique of this episode. I really do enjoy the crossovers, and I think the first crossover. So in this season, it's The Brave and the Bold, and there's a episode that comes before it in The Flash, is first season. But they are really solid episodes, and they're just fun episodes to watch. I think anytime you get to see these characters play around in each other's sandboxes is when you sort of get the highlights of the show.
Right, I really enjoyed this scene where Oliver has the arrows set up to hit Barry on turrets. It's so great.
Is it called Flash versus the Arrow?
Yeah.
The episode in the Flash season 1?
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but it's so much fun, and a lot of times the crossover in the Arrowverse actually has this thing where the tone of the show kind of carries over to the crossover. So the Arrow episode is much darker, but the Flash episode is actually a little bit lighter.
Yeah, and I really like in that episode, in the crossover episode, in the Flash, that, like you said, the part of the episode where Oliver is trying to teach Barry, and he teaches him some things that are really good, right? Like, you can't just rely on your powers. You have to, think about your surroundings, and you have to think about ways that people will outmaneuver you. But you also get some really bad advice from Oliver at the same time, like, guys like us don't get the girl, which we know is not true as we, follow this series along. But it's interesting to see the relationship between these two characters because they are different shows. They are very different tonally, but you still get to see Oliver be sort of this big brother, starter vigilante who thinks that Barry is so much better than him, but still has so much to learn.
Right.
One of the other, I think maybe the best part about the crossovers is Diggle. Diggle getting to be the comic relief. Yeah, so David Ramsey does a really good job with the comic relief. We, every time in the Flash crossover, the very first time, he runs up. Diggle just has this look on his face like this is I don't understand. This is amazing. And he says later on in the Arrow crossover, I'm never going to get used to that. We haven't gotten to the running gag where Flash picks him up and runs him places. And it keeps coming. But the other really good joke in this episode is where Barry runs in with sushi and just takes his mask off and starts eating. And everybody's like, hey, Lila doesn't know who you are. And he says, I just assumed you told her. And Diggle says, I can keep a secret. I mean, he's just got some really good stuff whenever he gets to be funny.
And he doesn't usually get to be that funny. Usually Felicity is the comedy relief on this show.
Nobody gets to be funny in Arrow.
Yeah, nobody ever gets to be funny. No one laughs in Arrow ever. But Diggle on the crossovers, he gets to play around a little bit more.
Yeah, and after the crossover's done and Captain Boomerang is taken care of, we have our huge mid-season cliffhanger where Oliver gets killed.
I remember watching this. I obviously knew when I saw the cliffhanger that he wasn't dead because then the show would have to be called something else. But at the same time, like, there is this sort of dramatic framing of it, and they're trying to set up Ra's al Ghul to be this badass, and it sort of works maybe in this episode because we haven't seen very much of him yet. But I remember when it came out, it was shocking to a lot of people that people weren't sure how he was going to come back or if he was going to come back the same way.
And this is where my comic book knowledge kind of ruined that for me because I was just screaming, Lazarus Pits. Lazarus Pits. It's the Lazarus Pits. Oh, man. This was a lot of... it was a great cliffhanger to leave it on. I just wish I could have believed that they were actually in danger of Oliver dying. Unfortunately, that was not really the case. It picks back up pretty quickly where, Ray is trying out his new suit. You also have, after Oliver, quote unquote, dies, you do have Laurel officially becoming Black Canary. And then you have Brick coming in and, being awesome. I really love Vinnie Jones. If you have not seen the series Gallivant and you like musicals, Vinnie Jones is amazing in it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think Brick was a stronger villain than Raish was for most of this season. He manages to be, like, intimidating, but he's still kind of, he's still a grunt. He's not really like a criminal mastermind. He's just, smart enough and strong enough to sort of keep in charge of of his enterprises. But I think the really interesting thing about Oliver, the fake out with Oliver's death, is how the other characters have to sort of step up in his absence. I mean, we even get to see Diggle, out in the field, which we don't usually get to see a lot of in this particular series, or at least not yet. We haven't seen a lot of. So it's interesting to see like all of these characters band together. Although it does raise the question, like, does Oliver really do this much that it takes like 6 other vigilantes to replace him? like how much does Oliver actually do? I guess for Starling City, is he the only one holding it together?
I mean, yeah, because you got a police captain who's just drunk all the time.
Oh yeah, we do get to see him sink back into drinking.
Also, Thea gets a crazy, not Roy Harper boyfriend, who I just remember him looking like a DJ because he was a DJ. And then all of a sudden, he's a member of the League of Assassins.
Yes, DJ by day. Wait, DJ by night. League of Assassin also by night? What's he do during the day?
Yeah, that was kind of amusing, and it kind of played up to the League of Assassins is everywhere and you can't trust anybody. But he was like the only character that could have been in the League of Assassins. Like, we know too much about Ray and Roy. We know too much about everyone else. Like, that was the only one that it could have happened. I mean, I don't know. It was just a silly little thing, and I laughed out loud when it revealed that he was an assassin.
I did kind of enjoy, though, sort of the reveal of Thea, because he does, like, when it's revealed, he does attack her, right? And the whole point is he, if you take out Oliver's sister, that weakens him. But then it turns out that Thea can defend herself, right? And so there's this whole long, drawn-out fight in her apartment, and she's able to take him on, basically. And I loved that, because we sort of have this problem in comic books sometimes where female characters especially are just sort of used as motivations for the male characters, or they're the people that need to be saved. And it was just kind of nice to see Thea be like, no, I'm not a liability. Like, I can take on somebody who is League trained as well. So that was kind of a cool twist too.
I think one thing that we learned from both of these shows this season, Arrow and The Flash, is that the Berlanti Arrowverse is never going to pull off a Kaiser Soze. It's never going to be, oh, I didn't know he was evil. It's never going to happen. And, with a lot of the just very ham-fistedness of Arrow shows that. And then on The Flash, where we almost have an immediate reveal that the person we think is good is a bad character. It's almost like they tried 2 different approaches, and the just like Chase, the DJ, had to be a bad guy. There was no way we didn't know that from the beginning, but they played it like we didn't know, and that's much less successful than on The Flash, when Harrison Wells, we find out almost immediately, is not who he says he is. But yeah, surprise is definitely never a thing that the Arrowverse has on its side.
Well, I would almost question, like, is it possible to pull off that big of a shocker for a property that's been around for as long as this one has? I mean, like you said, we know too much about Ray Palmer to think that he's part of the League of Assassins. He's an established comic book character. So, I wonder how difficult it would actually be to pull off a surprise like that, knowing, like, as much as most people do, and as much as most fans of these shows comb, each individual scene for clues as to, what's coming up, like what character's been teased this week. I wonder how much of a surprise you can really have for these types of properties.
Yeah, I don't think you can have too much of a surprise, particularly just because we know we know immediately whenever people are cast.
Right. Or even when they're mentioned, or something else is sort of teased in the series. Like, you immediately have all this history to a character, even though the character hasn't even appeared on screen yet.
Right. That's one of the reasons why I think the Flash's approach with its the Flash does a really good thing in season 1 with the episode ending. The stingers that you get at the end, where you see an evil person doing something evil, and it really it gives you an insight to characters, and it says we're not about trying to surprise. Yeah, this guy's evil. Let us show you something evil he's doing instead. So yeah, I know there's not an element of surprise, but I think seeing them run alongside each other this season, you see the Flash immediately doing things differently than Arrow did, and in some ways much more effectively. I think that's why, reason why Arrow 3 starts to fall flat toward the end of the season is that it suffers by comparison.
Well, and there's one thing, there's this entire moment back and forth where Ra's al Ghul, towards the end of the season, offers Arrow the chance to become the next Ra's al Ghul, or Ra's al Ghul. Yeah. And, it's this stunning thing where, because Thea is the one who killed Sarah, Oliver pretty much has to go. Otherwise, Thea's going to be hunted by the League constantly. It's this great thing, and I don't think that they pull off the Oliver was just pretending to join the League very well.
No, although would season 4 of Evil Oliver, would that have been a show? That could have been a show.
That would have been an interesting twist. Oliver is the villain of his own show.
We do get Nazi Oliver in a season or 2, so that's so we do get to see him be a villain eventually, but
yeah, I don't know. Like, the problem is that they ask us to believe that he's been brainwashed by the League, right? But I don't know. Stephen Amell is a pretty good actor, but I don't know if he's that great of an actor. Diggle certainly believes it, right? The season ends with Diggle being extremely upset with Oliver, which is new, right? Because Diggle is usually his pretty constant support. But Oliver, while pretending to be evil, kidnaps Lila while Diggle's baby is at home, right? And Diggle's baby is an important plot point later, so I thought I would mention her. But Diggle's really, really angry with Oliver, for this lie, even though I don't think the audience is as angry. And I think that was one of the other parts of this. When characters have reactions that you don't quite understand, it really takes you out of the story and undercuts your opinion of that character. And for me, it was kind of like, how did you not know that he was pretending, Diggle? Like, I don't really understand. I just didn't understand why he was so pissed, and why he was so pissed for like 3 or 4 episodes. It kind of bothered me a little bit.
Well, he's not the only character. I don't understand Ra's al Ghul. I don't get him at all. I don't know why he turned into like a stalker. I don't. I know I mentioned this last week, but a TV critic named Ryan McGee on a podcast he was doing back when the season was running just referred to it as swim fanning. Just constantly this. Why are you so obsessed with this guy? Find somebody. He's not that into you. Find somebody else. Your daughter seems to want to be in charge. She's pretty cool. What's the deal, bro?
Well, and like there's this weird, like, there's a prophecy, and like the person who survives his sword. No, like none of this is like adequate character motivation for him to act the way that he's acting. I don't know. Especially following the heels of, we talked about a lot last week about Deathstroke and how great of a villain he is. He really, Ra's al Ghul really falls flat in comparison.
Well, and we do have this moment that I really appreciate at the very end of the season, when all of Team Arrow is being poisoned and Oliver leaves them to die, supposedly, like, thus proving that he has been changed. And Barry just shows up and saves them in the next episode.
Deus ex Flashina.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, that is something that is always hanging over this show, where you have a normal powered hero. Barry could stop Oliver's stuff so easily. Barry could always come in and help and be done, and back to Central City.
That's always been my complaint about the MCU as well. Like other than convenience and the fact that these characters can't seem to get out of their own way, superheroes seem to have issues with that. It's a constant reminder that if these characters live in the same universe and can get to each other rather easily, why don't you team up all the time? Why aren't you just the super friends every week?
Right. And I think the MCU and Marvel in general is a little bit better at dealing with that because their heroes are superpowered people and not gods like the Flash. So it's easier to imagine that Captain America can't get across the world in 10 seconds, whereas the Flash can.
Yeah, whereas he literally is. He's in Nanda Parbat, like. And then I remember they asked him, like, do you want to come help us with this? And he's like, no, I got to go deal with my own stuff now, and just leaves. like it's a very flimsy excuse when it literally took him, like you said, 10 seconds to get there in the first place.
Right. All right. And by the end of this season, Oliver is dealing with more meta-powered humans, which is interesting, and I think it's a little bit more of a challenge for him. And you also have Ray helping him out a lot, and like you said earlier, Roy Harper ends up taking the fall for Oliver to prevent everything from going poorly, and they defeat Ra's al Ghul, and then John Barrowman, who's been kind of disowned by Thea, I mean, pretty much disowned by Thea by this point for being a terrible father, becomes the new Ra's al Ghul. And you find out that the only person that Ra's al Ghul is afraid of is a man by the name of Damien Dark.
Yeah, there's a lot of teasing and setting up of Damien Dark this season, especially near the end, where there's sort of the fake out where you think you're going to see him, but then you don't. It's really just somebody else who's working for him. But I think it's interesting that Malcolm Merlyn is such a weird villain, or part-timer villain now, I guess. He's sort of helping them, but he's only really doing his own thing. I mean, I think it's weird because we're supposed to dislike Malcolm Merlyn, but he's played by the most likable person probably in the universe. So sometimes it's really hard to get past like the charm of John Barrowman to Malcolm Merlyn. But he drugs his daughter and has her kill Sarah at the very beginning of this.
Just to save his ass.
Yeah, and so like he didn't even do it himself. Like that's the thing, is that like this character is a really terrible father and a terrible person, and the fact that Thea turns out the way she does by the end of this season really says more about Thea as a character than it does about him.
Right. And I will be talking about this more next week, but I feel a lot of the same way about Damien Dark, where Damien Dark really his character shines more in Legends of Tomorrow than it does in Arrow.
Oh, I would say the same thing actually about Malcolm Merlyn too.
Exactly.
I think the season where he's the villain, and he's the villain the same season as Damien Dark.
Right.
League of Evil, yeah. They are way better suited to that show, I think, than they are to the Arrowverse or to the Arrow show.
Arrow's always had a villain problem.
Besides Deathstroke.
Well, what the problem with him is we don't get him all the
true.
time.
Although we get to see him this season, right? Like Oliver takes Thea to the island, and Deathstroke was not killed at the end of the second season. He was put in a super secret illegal prison to dry out from the Mirakuru. Yeah. It's really unclear what they plan on doing with him there. But yeah, we get another episode with Deathstroke, which is pretty.
Hanging with Deathstroke.
It's always nice when Manu Bennett gets to come back to the show. We've talked a lot about how the internal politics of DC often prevent them from doing things with his character, but whenever we get to see him, that's usually a pretty solid episode.
Right. And I'm trying to remember, is it this season or was it last season where during the Suicide Squad episode you hear Harley Quinn? I think it was last season.
I think it's the very first episode they have Suicide Squad. You get to see her, like, her outline, like her silhouette against, like, one of the cells, and you get to hear her.
Yeah, I man. Yeah, but...
Show, though, they want you to, like, they want to tease Batman, but they don't want to actually, like, give away any of the good stuff about Batman.
There's I don't remember if it's a Supergirl episode or a crossover that she appears in down the road where you actually see like Bruce Wayne's name on like a phone. Like so he exists in one of the that exists, and so there's maybe that one with the Harley Quinn. It's like they try to sneak in and say, yeah, Batman and his rogues gallery really do exist, but we can't talk about them.
Right, and I mean, in later seasons, they just mention Batman and really talk about Batman. But I think this wraps up what we have to say about Season 3. Are there any final thoughts about this third season of Arrow as a whole?
The only thing that I will mention is that at the end of the season, Oliver leaves Starling City. He hangs up the hood and says that he's leaving the vigilantism in the capable hands of everyone else who's become a hero this season. But he leaves for Felicity, and I have a lot of feelings about Felicity. A lot of people ship them. To me, this was the beginning of the end of Felicity being a great character, mainly because I think she becomes a caricature of herself in later seasons, and we can talk about that. But actually giving them sort of this happy ending felt a lot like fan service. By setting Oliver up to have a healthy, well-adjusted relationship now, everything else in season 4 is going to feel like moving backwards. Like Oliver can't learn anything. And to me, that really bothered me.
And the season finale also violates one of the prime directed TV tropes. If a character is driving in a car and talking with his or her passenger and says, "I am happy," which Oliver does, the laws of TV say you immediately have to be T-boned by another car, fade to black, cut to black, end of season. It happened in Alias. It's happened in multiple other shows. This was wrong.
But I think that's all I really have to say about season 3 is that I don't know, the Felicity thing to me seems very forced at the end of the season.
Okay, well, let's talk about The Flash and how very different this show is. The Flash season 1 introduced our officially puts forth Grant Gustin as Barry Allen. And along with that, we have a few members of Team Flash who some of them I love and some of them I really, 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 really don't like. Huh? We'll get to who I really, really dislike. But first, let's talk about the good here. Team Flash is headed up by Tom Cavanaugh as Dr. Harrison Wells. What do you guys think about Tom Cavanaugh?
I love Tom Cavanaugh. I'm an early adopter of Tom Cavanaugh. You may have heard of this little show called Ed that launched not only his career, but also Julie Bowen and Justin Long. It was a delightful show, and I was so glad to see him on this show. He is the best person in the entire Arrowverse.
He is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, and we'll talk about sort of the season joke with him as we go along in The Flash, but he's just such a versatile and delightful actor. I mean, even his worst characters on this show steal a lot of the scenes, I think, from other characters.
All right. Next up, we have... Let's go with Danielle Panabaker as Dr. Caitlin Snow, who I also enjoy quite a bit.
I did not enjoy her as much this season as I did in later seasons, for reasons.
She's fussy.
She's fussy, and I mean, uptight is the wrong word, obviously, because there's a lot of sexist overtones to that, but she's not allowed to do a lot, and I think one of the criminal things in this first season is not giving Danielle Panabaker enough to do. She's sort of this forlorn love interest
of a dead guy.
Yeah, her fiance dies before in events that happen at the very beginning of the pilot, and she spends the rest of the season basically moping for him. And the only thing I will say that they did really well with her character is that, you know, she's smart, and it's not often that we get to see female characters display, you know, science and tech savvy that she does. But at the same time, the rest of her characters seem to just be like, I'm sad, my fiance died.
Lots of frowning.
Lots of frowning, lots of shrieking at people.
Although, we noticed something today. I had never noticed this before because I just was not familiar with the character. But in the finale, so big course correction from the beginning to the finale, you actually see Killer Frost in the last episode.
Yeah.
First season.
So people who were comic book fans, when they were introduced to Caitlin Snow, would immediately recognize that in the comics, she is Killer Frost, who is a metahuman. And we don't get to see any of that except for that brief glimpse in the finale. But that was kind of nice, knowing that was something, a direction they could go in with the character. That sort of saved her from just being, you know, this sad person for most of the season.
Right. Next up, we have a character that is close to my heart. I truly love. Is Carlos Valdez as Cisco Ramon.
So, first of all, aren't you glad that they dropped his whatever voice accent thing he had going on in the pilot? He definitely find that. But what do you like about Cisco so much?
Out of all the characters, at least as far as the early seasons go, him and Barry seem the most likable. I really enjoy Cisco. I really enjoy his quips, and I mean, he's basically the humor of the show.
And can we talk about how his t-shirts basically represent another character on the show? He wears the best pop culture reference t-shirts. I mean, and he's a pop culture nerd as much as anything else, which is where a lot of the humor in the show comes from. But his t-shirts are definitely something that I look forward to seeing every week.
I don't know which season it was, but the Total Eclipse of the Heart t-shirt, the day after I found it and I bought it because I had to have it.
I think that happens for a lot of the t-shirts he wears. I think that, like, he wears them and then they're, like, gone from the internet the next day because they're just these delightful little references and puns, and, you know, you don't always get them, but when you do, they're pretty great.
All right. We also have an amazing actor, Jesse L. Martin as Detective Joe West, who is Barry's adoptive father. Now, I always feel a little bit bad for Jesse L. Martin because I always have to wonder, like, how on board is he with this show? Because he is such a good actor. And it's always just like, sometimes he must look at the script and be like, great, I have to do this. I have to say this with a straight face.
Well, couldn't the same be said for, I'm blanking on his name, Stein.
Victor Garber.
Victor Garber. He's not the only one.
Yeah.
But Jesse Martin definitely seems like the adult on the show.
Yeah. Well, I guess
neither one of them do.
Yeah, well, they do later, I think, in a later season. But both Victor Garber and Jesse L. Martin are, of course, Broadway talent. They're...
And while we're on the subject, we have to mention that Grant Gustin is the first of two major superheroes in the Arrowverse to be Glee alum.
That's right. And we do get to hear both of them sing. I think we actually get to hear Grant Gustin sing in this season, right? Like, he goes to karaoke with Caitlin. She's like, you even sing well? You know, like who are you? So, and I think that brings us to a strength overall of this season is just its ability to harnessed pop culture references, pop culture zeitgeists, you know, to have these little tongue-in-cheek references to Glee and to other things that actors have been on. I think that that's one of the big strengths of this show.
All right. And while we do also have Eddie Thawne as a temporary character who I enjoy very much, I guess it's time to talk about the elephant in the room. My least favorite character in the entire Arrowverse. Candace Patton as Iris West.
So you like her less than Laurel?
It is close, but I like her less than Laurel. And the reason why is because Laurel spends a lot of time not there.
Yeah, that's fair. We also have a special dislike of her for a very particular reason that comes up in later seasons.
Yes.
Again, what is it about her that's so...
I feel like everything that Dr. Caitlin Snow does this season where, you know, it could be sexist, or I could say things that have sexist undertones, I feel triple about that for Iris West. So excuse me for saying I think as a character she is shrill, she is overbearing, she is a terrible, terrible reporter. Like
She really is.
like one thing I can say for Laurel is every once in a while you get hints of a good, solid lawyer with Laurel. With Iris, you never get a good hint of any kind of good journalist. And it infuriates me where she essentially thinks like, oh, I have to be I need to put out a story that gets me a Pulitzer Prize every week. And I'm willing to put myself and everyone I know in danger to get that.
How much of the problems with her character? Also, I think we can talk about how they write the character. I think that's Candace Patton, right?
Yeah.
Is a good actor. I think, but I think you can only do so much with it. But there are a lot of things that are put in this character's way. I think that she has to be. So we know that she will eventually be Alan West. We know that she will in the future eventually marry Barry. So that's already predestined, but she has to make time with Joe's partner. And also something that I have a really big problem with as well that I think does no service to her character is she's put up against Felicity. And the show's like, no, you don't want Barry to be with Felicity. You want her to you know to it's just not believable because of course we want Barry to be with Felicity. She's much better. So we look at the alternative and we go,
well, and I think this is again part of the bigger problem with female characters for this first season. Danielle Panabaker, I mean, Caitlin Snow becomes such a better character when she's given more to do. I don't know if Iris is ever really given a lot more to do. I mean, she definitely is in later seasons, but she doesn't seem to have the range that Caitlin Snow is given. And really, this first season, both characters are underutilized. Both characters are definitely put in the girlfriend role, right? So Iris has to be the girlfriend of Joe's partner or the love interest of Barry. And her job as a reporter just seems to be like, again, like you said, she's terrible at it, but it just seems to be to give her something to do as opposed to, actually giving her a satisfying story arc.
Right. Yeah, so every time we talk about Iris West, I'm probably going to have an aneurysm or something. I grow to hate her so much in the later seasons.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the same problem can be said with Felicity in later seasons of Arrow, is that they both tend to be really judgy of some of the other characters, and sometimes not in ways that are helpful. And so it's sort of, and I'm not sure, I don't know, because there are definitely some moments where like Joe is able to provide Barry with like a moral compass, especially in this season. And I think they were maybe trying to do the same thing with Iris, but it doesn't completely work.
Okay. And now I'm going to go down some of the amazing reoccurring cast. Part of this season's strength, for one, is just the strengths of how great the Flash's Rogues Gallery is compared to Arrow. It all these.
Like, it's like they picked all the stuff that was just like what? Like, how is this a character? And they just went for it, like, completely unironically.
Right. Speaking of which, in the pilot episode, one of my favorite moments is when you see in the background, you see a cage with the word Grodd on it, and it is open. I love creature features. I was so ecstatic that they might actually introduce Gorilla Grodd into this world, and of course later on we'd find out that they do, and it is amazing.
And for those of you who don't know, Gorilla Grodd is a talking... well, no, he's not talking. He's a telepathic gorilla. And that is a major reoccurring villain in this show. Like, this show is very different from Arrow. Arrow's villains are at least very believable. These villains are crazy. They have weird powers. They're not even people. Like, Grodd is not a person. And so it really, and again, they do this all very unironically. They just lean into it, and it makes it a very enjoyable show in some ways, because you're just like, yeah, this is happening. They are fighting a telepathic gorilla now.
Yeah. And also coming up here, we have probably the best use of stunt casting, period, in this entire Arrowverse is John Wesley Shipp as Barry's father. John Wesley Shipp played Barry Allen in the 1990 live-action Flash TV show.
Which I remember. I watched it as a much younger person. And it was great. I actually still remember the episode. You know, they do it in this, you know, down when Cisco tests, you know, how fast can Barry run. I still remember John Wesley Shipp with his big, bulky. Well, I don't know. Was the suit bulky, or is John Wesley Shipp that bulky? He is a very strong man. But I still remember him putting on the suit and like running on a track to see how fast he could go, an outdoor track. It was a good show. It did not live very long.
But it's really cool because, again, the show it loves references like this. You know, like John Wesley Shipp. Mark Hamill appears, reprising his role as the
from
trickster.
That same show.
From that same trickster in The Flash, for those of you who know anything he did outside of Star Wars. And he reprises that character in this season. And not only is he amazing as the trickster, he's really good and genuinely terrifying. But it's also that, like, look what we're doing with Luke Skywalker. You know, like, the show is very happy to make those references and to cast people that they just really like in these roles.
And, you know, going back to John Wesley Shipp, one of the great things is, one of the great things about Dawson's Creek is when Dawson inevitably runs afoul of somebody or gets into trouble, and he always goes back to his dad for that fatherly advice. And if you missed that, if you were a Dawson's Creek watcher and you missed that fatherly advice, well, you get it here again, except instead of chopping firewood or whatever great cool thing, you know, Dawson's dad was doing, Barry's dad is on the other side of a prison cell because, oh, by the way, he killed his wife.
Well, everyone believes he killed his wife, except for Barry, right? Who's trying to prove his innocence the whole season.
Right. And speaking of just other beautiful casting, I mean, Clancy Brown as Gorilla Grodd / the General. Clancy Brown, people will probably know as the guy who voices Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob, but also about 2/3 of any TV show you pick. Clancy Brown is just one of the most prolific voice actors in anything. I just love him so much. And just having him do Gorilla Grodd, and I think he he does Gorilla Grodd in the Justice League cartoon from the early aughts.
Oh, I did not know that. That's really interesting.
Now I need to double check. Okay. He does Lex Luthor.
Yeah, but he's still part of that DCU.
Part of the family.
Yeah, he's part of the family.
Right. But we also have, as later reoccurring characters, but Dominic Purcell as Heatwave and Wentworth Miller as Captain Cold.
The Prison Break brothers. It's great. And I love all the references to Prison Break that occur throughout their appearances, too.
They were sort of breakout characters. Because they play Captain Cold and Heatwave, and they're wonderfully overacted, especially in the first season of The Flash. But it's a choice that they're making, and it's a wonderful choice. But I feel like they just enjoyed having them on the show so much that they became these these wonderful reoccurring characters.
And Snart really is. I think Snart in the Flash's Rogue Gallery really is classically the most prominent one, not a speedster.
Of the not a speedster
of
variety.
the not a speedster variety, he definitely wins the award for most prominent, and I think really most developed in the comics. So it's really nice that they got somebody like Wentworth Miller who does have range and is able later to put some complexity into the character. And we also know that Wentworth Miller is one of the few actors in the Arrowverse who later on is granted one of these Arrowverse contracts where he just has a contract to appear on a number of episodes in any of the shows. So he's really recognized for his versatility later. Dominic Purcell, not, but that's the point.
But he's still one of my favorite characters when we get to his main role in Legends of Tomorrow. He maybe doesn't have the range that Wentworth Miller does, but he definitely has that likability and complexity, I think.
Maybe he does have that range. We just don't see it in the series. I'm sure he's a versatile actor.
Then next up, as far as the cast goes, I think that's actually pretty much it for major cast. We have an amazing level of nepotism. We have Robbie Amell as Ronnie Raymond / Firestorm.
Well,
this was not my favorite. I love Victor Garber, who is the other half of Firestorm. I think Victor Garber is amazing. However, Robbie Amell, he's just so flat.
Robbie Amell is an actor.
Yeah.
That's about it.
And he looks a lot like Stephen Amell, which was kind of fun, I guess. But he doesn't bring anything to this role. I guess he's a good-looking guy, and so maybe they wanted someone not Victor Garber to play
This is the CW.
The visible half of Firestorm. But again, he sort of seems to exist in this first season just to exist. He doesn't really have any. He doesn't do anything this season, really. I think Victor Garber has way more range than he does.
All right.
Talk really quickly about the fact that Ronnie and Caitlin get married.
Yeah, I think that happened.
Wow. Okay.
It got. So the thing is, we're going to talk obviously about the later seasons of Flash later, but Danielle Panabaker actually protested after season 3 and said, I need better storylines than to just be the love interest every season. And we'll talk about how that's a problem in seasons 2 and 3. But I feel like this season really highlighted that problem with Danielle Panabaker, is that, they get married. And that's the entire character arc for both Ronnie and Caitlin this season.
Yeah, Ronnie exists just to save the world. That's the reality of it.
Although Firestorm as a concept is interesting. It's obviously a concept that comes from the comics. Basically, he and Ronnie and Martin Stein are two very different people who have the ability to fuse together and become this entity known as Firestorm. And that's interesting. It's just Ronnie's not. Ronnie is literally the least interesting part of that entire concept.
Right. But now we should probably talk about the actual story of the season. The story is
A Flash.
yeah, the story is fine. It's very simple. The show goes out of its way to end on cliffhangers every episode. Kind of annoyingly so. But it also really tries to make you think that Harrison Wells is not the Reverse Flash.
Does it though?
I mean, it does multiple instances where like the scene where Harrison Wells and Reverse Flash are in the same room at the same time.
Well, yeah, but Tom Cavanaugh as Harrison Wells keeps like, I mean, he's definitely channeling creepy this whole season. Like, it's very hard to figure out what his motives are. And so, again, I'm not sure how much of a surprise it actually was when we find out that he's the Reverse Flash. I don't know. Were you surprised the first time you watched it, Sam?
Oh no. And this is definitely something that Tessa, and I'm inviting this, but as soon as you see Harrison Wells in a wheelchair, you go, oh, he's evil.
Well, okay. And so I do this for a living, so I try really hard not to go on a rant about this kind of thing. The one real weakness of the Arrowverse, we talked about last week how Greg Berlanti, really after Arrow Season 1, tries very hard to diversify the cast.
Captain Singh talks about his boyfriend in an episode, and it's absolutely not plot related at all. It's a Big Belly burger joke, which are great, by the way.
Well, I mean, and he tries to diversify both the casting and the characters, right? We have a lot of gay characters who are introduced, whether plot related or not. We have a lot of racially diverse characters who start being introduced. I mean, Joe and Iris are black, right? And we get more of that as these seasons go on. The one really terrible part of the Arrowverse, the one place where they fall down in this regard, is disability. And part of this is a problem with the source material. Because comic books classically are really terrible about propagating disability myths. And so one of them is obviously that in order to show that you're evil, you must be disabled in some way. And so that's part of the problem with this first season, is that Harrison Wells is evil, he's the Reverse Flash, and he's in a wheelchair. The other bad part of it is that he's not really in a wheelchair, right? It's the disability drop myth, where people who are disabled aren't really disabled. And so it's really uninviting, and it's really unfortunate that they had to adapt it in that way. I think, personally, I didn't need the disability highlight to do that.
And they try to, whether they're aware of this or not, they pass it off. I think it's the penultimate episode of the season where Cisco goes, look, the bottom of his wheelchair is a power generator. That's why he had to be in the wheelchair the whole time. It totally makes sense. It's not a thing.
And he asks about it too. He says, why was he in a wheelchair? And the answers are immediately very, very disabled phobic. I think Joe says, like, to gain sympathy. Like people who are in wheelchairs just to gain sympathy from people, or to distract you from what was really going on. And so, to me, because believe me, I will bring it up every time it comes up in this series. It's one of many bad examples of disability representation on this show.
Right. I think season 4 does it the worst, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. I do think that Kavanaugh, who is the man who killed Barry's mother, and framed Barry's father, and is just a man who wants to get back so he can defeat the Flash. Right. I think Henry Kavanaugh does a great job of acting a character who loves the Barry Allen that he's working with, but hates the man who he becomes.
Obsessed with him. And I think that with all of the complexities of obsession, it's not It's a better version of what they were trying to do in season 3 of Arrow. Because in that version, Ra's al Ghul is obsessed with Oliver, but it does not work because there's no complexity to it. Here we get the complexity of someone who sees himself as the opposite of the Flash, and they have all this history that Barry doesn't even know about, right? But he sees himself as the father of the Flash, and he creates the accident that gives Barry his powers. He loves him and he hates him. He killed his mother to give him like a trauma, but then realizes he has to help him get over that trauma in order to get home. And Tom Cavanaugh plays all of this so well. He actually plays it better than the actor who they later get to play Eobard Thawne. He does such a great job, I think.
Yeah, that actor is Matt Letcher.
Yeah, and that was a weird part of this season for me, was having the two actors, because Eobard Thawne, when he goes back in time, he takes on the persona and the face of Dr. Harrison Wells. And to me, I think it's because they were trying to separate those two characters so they could have Tom Cavanaugh play different versions of Harrison Wells later. But the problem is that Tom Cavanaugh's a better actor, and so he does a better job with the character, I think, than...
Right. Interestingly, though, Matt Lesher actually played Tom Cavanaugh's son in the show Eli Stone.
Eli Stone, I'd forgotten about that show. That's interesting.
Yeah. But anyway, it's just Henry Cavanagh is great. The plotline for this season is just very basic, where Barry keeps getting a villain of the week. He's got to run faster in order to do it. In order to overcome the villain, Barry, run faster, Barry. And eventually, they discover that Iris's fiance, Eddie Thawne, is the progenitor of Eobard Thawne, who is also Harrison Wells. And there's a great moment where Eddie Thawne realizes that in order to stop the world from ending, he has to kill himself to prevent him from ever having Eobard down the line. What did you guys think about that moment?
So, can we talk about how, for a show that spends a lot of time talking about time travel...
And Back to the Future specifically.
And Back to the Future, it cannot get the rules of time travel straight. Like, I am willing... Like, I am not... I know you're pickier about time travel narratives than I am, Sam. I am willing to say, okay, this is magic, right? Like, this doesn't make sense, but I'm willing to accept this system for the sake of this movie or show or whatever it is that I'm watching. But this show keeps, like, it's so confusing, and it's really hard to keep the rules straight. Like, he can run back in time to kill Barry's mom, but then he can't run forward in time. Like, and Barry has to go through this whole process where he has to collide with a particle in order to open a wormhole. But then we see him later just running back in time the same way that the Reverse Flash does. It's very confusing, and it seems very contrived. Like, it's easy for him to run back in time until it's not, because we have to do this for a plot point.
It's the same thing with the superheroes crossing over. Why wouldn't that happen more often? But, the Arrowverse loves Back to the Future. So much so that Biff Tannen becomes a regular character on another.
I forgot about that.
But the show likes to model itself on the closed loop model of time travel from Back to the Future, and also the Terminator series. Except when it's convenient to talk science, we flip over to quantum theories of time travel, which is where you get the idea of the multiverse from, and how and that's the quantum theory is what gives us Flashpoint later on, which of course they handle terribly, but that's a later discussion for another day. But even here in season 1, they start conflating the two theories of time travel, which are both very different, and it's very frustrating to watch.
Although I will say the moment that he does shoot himself is very moving. From a character perspective, we weren't expecting him to die. I don't know if any of us were expecting any character to die on this show, because this show isn't Arrow. The stakes are very different for Flash than they are for Arrow. So, I mean, like, he's not a character that I think we were super invested in, but it is still a moving character, or a moving development in terms of, he realizes that there's only one way out, and he kills himself, thus Back to the Futuring Eobard Thawne.
And that's a very, and then we do the Back to the Future thing in the last season that we just saw.
Yeah, we did repeat that again in a later season.
But I think that's a credit to, and I'm looking up the actor's name. His name is Rick Cosnett. Hey, fun fact, he's Hugh Grant's cousin. But anyway,
he's so handsome.
But it's a mark. It's a credit to his acting as well as the acting of the others. That when he does die, it does land. We do care about him, even those of us who are baffled and somewhat angered about the logic of the plot. Still, you did a good acting job there. And there's a lot of good acting on these shows.
And he's used later on too. I mean, like, he records something for Iris, I think, and it gets brought up in a later season. So, I mean, he does sort of become this emotional touchstone that we don't reference a lot, but we do come back to this moment a couple of times in the show.
Right. And another just moment to discuss in this show, towards the end, they make this trap for the Reverse Flash, and surprisingly, Arrow and the Atom show up. And I thought that was a really cool moment.
The Arrow and Firestorm.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Arrow and Firestorm. I thought that was a really cool moment.
Yeah, I mean, and we talked about this when we were talking about Arrow Season 3. Whenever we get to see these characters play in each other's worlds, I think that is a strength of this show. Not just in the crossovers, but when we see characters just come over, right, to help or to say hello. I think Felicity and Ray come over at a different point in this season, too. It's fun to see these characters interact, and I think if we were to classify Flash in the Arrowverse, it's the fun one, or at least it was when it came out. I think Legends has sort of taken over that title, but it's just this kind of fun. We get to see the Arrow go against the Reverse Flash, right? And we get to see Firestorm like actually be Firestorm and not just a confused person. So it's interesting to see when you get to see these characters play with each other.
Right. I mean, and later we do get to see, or I guess earlier in the season, Joe and Cisco go to Starling City and figure out how whether or not Dr. Wells really is Dr. Wells. And then Lance, Captain Lance helps them, and Cisco meets Black Canary. And there's this, I mean, it's a lot of fun when it's not just the main characters interacting, it's the other characters.
Yeah, and I think another part of that, and I prefer this over the whole Thawne thing, head and shoulders, is again Captain Cold. Captain Cold, Heatwave, and Golden Glider.
Golden Glider's
the
his
sister.
Yeah.
I really enjoy the fact that they keep popping up, and I think the payoff with that is even better than the end of the season. Where Barry enlists Snart to scheme to transfer them from one black site to another black site, which of course Joe, being the conscience, is like, you can't do this. But at the end of the day, of course Snart, it's sudden but inevitable betrayal. And when he says, you betrayed me, he's like, well, yes. And now all these bad guys owe me a favor. What did you think? You never give the guy everything before he does the thing for you. You could have kept the boxes of files. You could have deleted them from the server, but held on to the paper copies until he did the thing for you. But dumb Barry.
I think my favorite line that Wentworth Miller as Snart delivers is that actually at the end of that speech where he says, like, of course I betrayed you. I'm a bad guy. And my favorite line is at the very, very end where he says, I really think that if you think about it, you're not angry at me. You're angry at yourself. it's just this wonderful moment that's acted really, really well. I mean, Snart is such a like chaotic villain. He's almost more interesting to me, as well as Tom Cavanaugh acted Eobard Thawne, the Reverse Flash, this season. I think that Captain Cold almost steals the show with just how, I mean, he figures out Barry's identity within like 3 encounters with him. Like, it's really, really interesting, and a lot of the acting really sets this show apart, I think. The other thing, too, is I honestly think the Monster of the Week works really well in this show, like almost better than the season-long arc does. I mean, the whole conceit of this show is after the particle accelerator explosion, Barry is, of course, made into the Flash, but a lot of other people gain powers, too, including a bunch of criminals, right, who immediately start using their powers for nefarious purposes. And so he sort of self-tasks the team with, you know, going around and capturing these metahumans, which brings up all sorts of ethical questions about imprisonment.
So they can be rehabilitated, because Barry thinks, you know,
right,
the being powered doesn't make them evil. You know, and that becomes a thing that has a lot of play later in seasons, and is very interestingly compared to the idea of aliens and Supergirl later. But Barry from the get-go believes in rehabilitation, believes in people, which is why he's of course different from Oliver, who thinks that everybody is terrible.
Right. The show is very optimistic. I mean, it's Barry half the time just convinces people to lay down their powers or to stop whatever it is that they're doing, you know, rather than just fighting them. And I think that actually worked pretty well for this show. I mean, I was way more invested in, like, you know, seeing Gorilla Grodd and who else is the Trickster and Snart and Weather Wizard, Nimbus. You know, these crazy villains. I was, you know, especially in the early seasons, I think it works really well.
Right. And another thing that really works here is because they're not just mobsters, they all feel different.
They all have a thing.
Right. And you even get into the metahumans that, like the Nuclear Man or Fallout or whatever his name is, where his power is dangerous. He does not want to be.
Right. Well, it's dangerous to him too, right?
Right. So there's an underlying tragedy in some of these characters, and it makes it worth going into. Plus, since Barry doesn't kill people, all these guys get to live and come back another day. It's great.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I mean, because it does come up, like we said, like he says that he's interested in rehabilitating them, but he's so busy he doesn't actually have time to rehabilitate them. Something that this first season really, it calls itself out on it, right? Like at the end of the season, it's like, yeah, like this is actually not a good idea to just imprison people without due process. But what's the alternative, right? And we get to see some alternatives in later seasons. But yeah, I think it's a really well-structured season. Again, the through arc, without Tom Cavanaugh's acting, I'm not sure how well it would actually stand up. But the episode by episode, this is a really fun show to watch this first season.
Yeah. And I think that wraps things up. Did you guys pull up any Twitter information or any pluggables?
I did. I actually just made myself a Twitter account, which shows you how behind the times I am. My Twitter handle is @Swehla, SWEHLA, Tessa, TESSA.
And I'm a professional lurker on Twitter, but you can find me at Sam_Morris79.
Okay. And listeners, you can find me on Twitter at HebrewsPaleo. You can find the podcast on Twitter as well at Geek101pod. And you can find us at geek101.com or geek101podcast.com. That'll be it for today. Class dismissed.